Okay, so we're talking about mechanisms or a mechanistic explanation, and those mechanisms need to be simple rather than complex. So whatever thing we're trying to explain, cognition in this case, needs to be the result of simpler mechanisms, right? Or the parts of simpler pieces of something interacting. So I'm going to start with a video of the heart or the cardiac cycle, and then we'll talk about that. But it's going to be a little loud, so I would probably maybe turn it down and then turn it back up gradually and try to adjust. So um, here we go.
This animation illustrates a single cardiac cycle, starting with the right side of the heart. In reality, of course, the two sides of the heart work together at the same time, but it is easier to understand if we look at them separately, because each side of the heart has a different function. The cardiac cycle begins as deoxygenated blood flows from the body into the right atrium via the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. In the next phase of the cycle, the right atrium contracts, pumping blood into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. Once the right ventricle fills with blood, the tricuspid valve closes to prevent blood flowing back into the atrium. The right ventricle contracts, forcing the pulmonary valve to open as blood is pumped into the pulmonary artery. Blood then travels to the lungs and the pulmonary valve closes. At the same time, the right atrium relaxes, ready to accept the next intake of blood. In the lungs, the blood picks up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. Oxygenated blood flows from the lungs into the left atrium via the pulmonary veins. The left atrium contracts to pump blood into the left ventricle through the mitral valve. Once the left ventricle has filled with blood, the mitral valve closes. Next, the left ventricle contracts, forcing the aortic valve to open, allowing blood to be pumped into the aorta and from there around the body. The aortic valve closes to prevent blood flowing back into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle relaxes, ready to accept the next intake of blood. Cardiac cycle is now complete.
Okay, so you might be saying, why did I show you that? This is the cardiac cycle, which describes how certain parts of the heart, including the valves, the atrium, the ventricles, right? How they all interact in a way that achieves the goal of getting deoxygenated blood, sending it to the lungs to gather oxygen, and then sending the oxygenated blood from the lungs to the rest of the body so that the body can use that oxygen, right? So this is a mechanistic explanation of how the heart achieves the goal of getting oxygen to the rest of the body. And so this is a relatively simple thing for trying to explain something as similar as a pump, like a pump, something like a pump. Uh, it's basically a pump, and it's not that hard to come up with an explanation, a mechanistic explanation for something like a pump. However, when trying to develop an explanation for something like the mind, there are a number of problems that are unique to the mind that aren't really a problem when trying to explain how something like a heart works, for example. Oops.
This animation
Okay. So now we're going to talk about Lebanese. I'm probably butchering that name. I don't really remember how to say it, but um, I think he's German, if I'm not mistaken. He's like a father of physics. He's like the Isaac Newton that that isn't as famous as Isaac Newton, right? And he invented calculus with different symbols than Isaac Newton. But uh, Lebanese's dream was to basically mechanize all reasoning. And his idea was if you could simply generate an alphabet of concepts so that certain symbols would refer to different concepts, and then generate some rules of inference, if you could do this, then any sort of answerable question in the world would be done by simply applying those rules to those symbols. And in a sense, you would just do the math. So to answer any question, you would just do the math, right? Um, and yeah, and he thought if you could do this, you could mechanize reasoning. And so I'm going to show another video. It's to give you a flavor of how people thought about this. Again, adjust the volume as you see as deemed appropriate.
At the turn of the 20th century, alongside thinking about the mechanization of physical work, people began to ponder the mechanization of mental work. One way to think about mental work or mental labor is the process of thinking that unfolds when making difficult decisions, which leads one to some state of belief about something. And at the time, people wondered if complex decision making could be mechanized.
And only in the recent years has anyone allowed their judgment, so to speak, with regard to making decisions, be made by a computer instead of by human beings.
For example, IBM's accounting machines would perform a series of calculations and store the intermediate results, allowing it to build on previous results to arrive at final answers.
In about 2 weeks, during which we had maybe a dozen hours of actual calculation, we did work that would have taken a man with a desk calculator 100 years.
And immediately, people wanted flexibility in terms of what these machines did. So the ability to change the sequence of operations became important. At first, this was done with plug boards, allowing one to reprogram the machine's operation physically. And people began thinking about how far we could take this process, embedding a sequence of mathematical and logical operations into a mechanism so that it can think for us.
Okay. So yeah, again, this is just to give you a flavor of how people thought about this. So now I'm going to go to the next video or next slide. And so the reason I showed you this, yeah, is it gives you a sort of idea of the goal of cognitive science, or one goal of cognitive science, which is to mechanize reasoning. But in trying to mechanize reasoning, we're faced with this philosophical problem, which is called the paradox of mechanical reasoning. And so, if we are mechanistic symbol manipulators, as someone like Thomas Hobbes would say, and mechanisms can only react to physical properties of things, then that means that the things are not reacting to the meaning of them because meaning isn't a physical thing. So it seems like if you're reasoning, you must be sensitive to the meaning of things, right? But meaning isn't really a physical thing. There's not like a meaning ometer that you can apply and measure a thing's meaning. So either you're not reasoning on the basis of meaning, or there's something more to meaning than the mere mechanisms. And in order to resolve this paradox, something physical would need to be sensitive to meaning. However, it's not entirely clear how one would do this. So, in a nutshell, the paradox of mechanical reasoning asks, how does a mechanism translate to meaning, right? So, how do these cogs, so to speak, in this guy's head, how does that lead to the idea of an apple? Which is related to another philosophical problem, which is called the paradox of mechanical reasoning, or sorry, the paradox of the problem of qualitative experience. And so the question is, how does consciousness arise from a purely, how does a state of awareness arise from a purely mechanical system? And so not only is it difficult to understand how a mechanical process could lead to a sense of meaning, which is the paradox of mechanical reasoning, but it's also not clear how a purely mechanical process could lead to consciousness. So, of course, the concept of consciousness in itself is pretty difficult to define in a straightforward way. But one definition is that consciousness refers to a subjective quality of experience or our individual awareness of mental states. Yeah, and so one important distinction that philosophers have made is that there is a phenomenal concept of the mind, which is how and why we have a specific experience. But there's also a psychological concept of the mind, which is more about cause and effect and what the mind does. So psychologists tend to deal with the psychological concept, whereas philosophers tend to be more concerned with the phenomenal concept of mind. Yeah, so problems related to the psychological concept of mind, such as perceptual discrimination, categorization, vision, these are often referred to as the easy problems of consciousness. And they're things that we've figured out to a large extent, whereas there are problems related to the phenomenal concept of the mind, and these are often referred to as hard problems of consciousness. And the fact that an objective account of the mind using physical and mechanical processes may not fully explain the subjective human experience. The fact that that happens is it's called the explanatory gap. Okay, and so one reason why consciousness is so difficult to explain is because it's an inherently subjective state that relies on things like introspection. However, science requires much more objectivity. So in this bat example, scientists know a lot about how bats navigate via echolocation. So the bat emits high-pitched sounds which bounce off an object in the animal's path, and the bat uses the reflection time as a measure of the object's distance. And neuroscientists understand the neural mechanisms underlying echolocation, and engineers have built sonar machines to use echolocation, similar to how a bat does. So we have an objective account of what a bat does, but that doesn't really tell us what it's like to be a bat. Another example is, imagine that a vision scientist is colorblind and she understands how color is perceived by the eyes and the brain, but that doesn't really help her in understanding what it's like to see color. Okay. Um, and I'm talking about like fully colorblind people, if that's the thing. So, okay, I went a little bit over, so sorry. We'll just keep going with this, and the next video we'll talk about the promise of AI.